It's so odd to have this setting. It's like the most indirect communication.
That's great. Oh, I mean, that's like one of the classes I took in college. We had to do different types of collaboration projects with classmates. And in that process, we had to do it in different ways. So on some projects, you could meet face to face. Others, you could only design the show through the phone and email. And so like it became, how do you design and collaborate when you can't be in the same room together, and like navigating those conversations and how to, read things. So I thought that was like a really good course. And now, now there's a layer of like video conferencing and things like that. But I thought that was like a really good way to kind of get you to start thinking about doing the work in a different manner, So yeah, I feel like that was great.
Yeah, Francesco, you can moderate. My friend is coming. She's outside.
Yes, I'm letting her in, but she has some troubles, maybe technical.
Okay.
Marine, she joined 3 times.
Okay, let me text her.
And then I unmuted her every time, but I don't know, maybe she's not connecting very well.
You just click yes, and she doesn't come.
Yeah, and she added another request.
Right, she's connecting.
Yeah, and another one, the 4th.
And the other girl?
No, just Marine. Only Marine. She's joining. If you want to try to tell her to.
I asked if she's sorry, Walter. This is like still the technical issues today. So we're still waiting for like a couple of people to join. You can write in the chat if you can hear us and stuff, if you're having any technical issues. But I think we can get Joe, turn off your camera. Giovanni, turn off your camera. Doesn't matter. Whatever. Great. So let's get started. And then, so this is a kind of a classroom, like setup. So technically, we cannot see you and we cannot hear you, but we can see everything. There's a chat on the right. You can just ask your questions, since this is kind of an open conversation. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar with SetPatrol. We're very excited. This is the last webinar of the series that we've had with Sarah, who's here today, who's an amazing costume designer based in New York. So we were lucky to have different master classes with her. She's really insightful, really amazing. And today we're going to be talking about how to build the world of your film. So we would love to know if some of your directors, DPs, what is your position on set? What is your level of experience, so we can help you a little bit better with this conversation. So Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us what you do.
Well, thank you for the lovely intro. I'm, as always said, my name is Sarah Cogan, and I'm a professional costume designer here in New York. And my experience ranges from doing like indie low budget projects to major motion network television, and then the gamut in between, along with both narrative and commercial work. So it's kind of me in a nutshell. And then I also run a podcast called Designing the Void, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts, that talks about film design and its influence on stories and the worlds we see on screen. So that's kind of, like I said, me in a nutshell.
So we were, with this conversation today, I guess we wanted to have a more general conversation that can apply to a lot of different creatives, depending on your position on set. It could be from, you know, when you're writing the screenplay to when you're actually meeting with your designer, speaking to your DP, and building the visual world of the film. So we have a couple of questions that we're going to be asking Sarah, and then at the end, feel free to write your questions in the chat if you have any specific insight that you need for a specific project. So what is world building to you, and do you think that every project, so film, commercials, branded content, all of that, do you think it requires this like world building conversations?
Yes, I do think that every single project requires some level of world building conversation, because the stories we tell, even if they're based in real life events like a biopic, they are, you know, imagined worlds where there are interpretations of the world, and there is a driving force behind the choices that we make and put in front of the camera to kind of create those things. So regardless of what you're doing, whether it's a contemporary piece, a period piece, a fantasy or sci-fi piece, you know, and then you can take it to any genre, we're still going to talk about what the worlds are and where, you know, and part of that is also like, what's the culture of the place that these people and the story is taking place in? How do these characters relate to one another, right? And this kind of goes into like the questions that you then want to ask when building worlds. So it really becomes a conversation that's essential to understanding what it is that we're putting together in the world on, you know, on screen.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess going back to the origin of like building that world, right? What I guess what are some insights when you're writing the screenplay, or if this is something that is a little bit more conceptual, like a music video or something like that, or branded content? What are the things that you have to keep in mind as a content creator when you're first building the world of the project?
Yeah. So when you're first building the world of your projects, I think you want to start off with actually at first allowing yourself to just collect information. Be really open, right? And gather and gather and gather and look at different possibilities and look at different visual languages that are out there in the world and see how they resonate for the world that you want to create. And, you know, oftentimes we'll have some sort of idea of something that pops in our head that's the initial impetus for our, you know, continued research and that kind of rabbit holing into the visual world. And so I think even as a writer, that can be really helpful if you're trying to figure out who your characters are and the environment that they live in, going out and looking at some of those images just to kind of help understand what you're thinking, you know, because that might inform how they interact with their world or how they behave as characters, or something you may trigger something for you that you hadn't thought about. And so a large part of starting the visual research of what this world is and thinking about that comes from this idea of looking out into the world to be influenced by everything and get a lot in your mind and kind of go, instead of going like, this'll do, this image will do, like, it's fine. Maybe going a step further or two steps further and saying like, but what else is out there? Like, yeah, that image works, but is it the best image that works to tell what I want to tell? What if there's something else out in the world? And so you can then kind of gather and accumulate a bunch of imagery to kind of inspire, and then from there start taking away the items that don't make sense to you, to the story anymore. And I think that that's then when you start really fleshing out, you'll start seeing themes in the things that you're pulling and themes in the imagery. And, you know, and also even looking at like the movies that would, if you're a director, and looking at how you want to shoot it so that you can edit it, and what the relationship is to the actual shooting process and the editing process, and how you want those things to kind of communicate to one another in telling your story, right? That's another form of language. And so you can start looking at like, well, what are the things that inspire me for this film or for this moment? And then that allows you to then kind of go from there in terms of what are the themes that go through this all the research, and what stands out in a way that shouldn't be here, and what stands out in a way that like, oh, this could be a really big moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So
So
I guess those are the like first preliminary questions that you have, right? When you're like building the big bang of the project, and then when you're entering, I mean, it could be different things, right? If you're writing a feature film, like you're gonna have 2 years probably of writing the draft. So that's the first phase. But if this is a commercial, then this is a really quick like turnaround, right? So like there's different levels of momentum we understand for each project, but when you're entering, like let's say not the pre-production, but you're starting to really build the world, what are those things that you have to keep in mind, and what are those practical things that you should be focusing on to build your aesthetic when you've kind of collected your inspiration and your references, and maybe let's say you have your treatment or something like that, right?
yeah. Okay. So what you do at that next step of actually like starting to solidify it, is that what I mean? Okay.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
So,
that, I understand that that translates in different ways for
yeah.
different projects, but I'm thinking, you know, like if you're writing your screenplay, probably you've put together like a Pinterest or like a nice treatment with some images, and then you start building the screenplay, and you have to transfer that well from your treatment into the screenplay before you enter into like pre-production and all of that. Same thing when
Yeah.
you're doing a music video or whatever. Like,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a level of when you're looking at, okay, I've got some ideas that I maybe put down, like that's specific to the writer director, right? Of like, I'm writing this film because I plan to direct it. And so I have this idea in mind. It then it becomes, you now are opening it. Like if you're bringing in ideally you're talking to your design team earlier in the process before you get even before you get funding, to get a clear sense of what you're doing. So you can really tell people like, we are prepared, because in film, filmmaking is visual art based in literature, right? We make film based off of a script. We make movies based off of a script. And people listen to how you say things over what you say.
mm-hmm.
And so that's why actors rehearse their lines and can deliver things in different ways, and it has a different intonation and a different meaning. Well, the same goes for how we shoot our scripts and how we approach that conversation that we're having. And in filmmaking, that conversation is done live in front of the camera and then edited in a room afterwards. And so getting prepared and being ready for that conversation to happen on set needs to happen long before you actually go into pre-pro, because by the time you get to production, if you haven't answered these major world building questions, you're going to find that you're just tired. You've had a lot of emotional ups and downs. You've got decision fatigue already, and now you have to deal with the how you say it, and it turns out you never really rehearsed it, right? And then you're going to go into production and you're going to go start shooting things that maybe you only thought about for like a day. And so it's the difference of, you just spent 2 years on a script, or you just spent a month writing a commercial and getting it approved by a client just to basically wing the execution, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to transitioning to production, you want to start having those conversations about, what is this world? Who are these characters? Why do they matter? What's important about them? How do we want to see them? How do we want to see the protagonist or our main character in relationship to the other characters around them? And like, this is, so for example, you can have somebody who is in the world but not of it, right? So in Lord of the Rings, for example, the hobbits all leave, the Shire to go out into the world. They're of the Shire, but once they go into the world, they stick out like sore thumbs because they're in it, but they're not of it, right? They don't connect with it, they don't relate it, and therefore we know as an audience that they're out of their element and going on this journey that's going to then change who they are fundamentally. So it's looking at how, breaking that down for all the beats in the story of, okay, where is our character now? Where's our main character now? And how do we see them through hair, makeup, and wardrobe, right? And just like the actual character design in relationship to the other characters and the other character designs. And then also the world that surrounds them, right? So how does the production design tell us something about what this character where this character is within that world. Because I think a lot of what we understand as people about people and why we tell stories is to understand one another through juxtaposition, through shared experiences of like, okay, this character went through this experience. There's a book called Wired for Story, and it talks about the psychology behind storytelling and why they think it's important for societies. And it's because what they think is that by hearing stories and by watching stories, we as humans get to then look at the world and say, well, if I was in this situation, then maybe I could handle it that way, or would I handle it this other way? So it gives us mental preparedness to come up to a situation that maybe we don't expect. Mm-hmm. So when we're telling our stories, that's part of what we're telling, right? And part of how we then build these worlds and create these worlds that these characters exist in. I mean, this is also like very poignant right now to ask these questions when talking about everything that's going on right now with racial discrimination and the way that we as an industry present the, you know, different cultures and people of color and people of different, you know, gender identities and different sexual preferences. Like, that ownership of what we see is on us as storytellers. So at this beginning phase, we need to be mindful of how we're telling these stories and look at what that means for building the world that we're building. You know, Absolutely. I just want, yeah, if that makes sense. So like, I think that it becomes, how do you come in and tell a more real story? And that can be, you know, there's a lot of things, right? There's world building that's just from the visual standpoint of color palette, right? So how do you build worlds based on color palette? Game of Thrones does that. And then they layered it with texture and they layered it with materials, right? So then they created these very separate kingdoms based on color, texture, and material availability per region, right? So then that was one question of how would each region be different from one another? And how are they the same? What's transferred from one region to another? So you can start kind of creating then these dynamics between the worlds of your story to help create a deeper understanding of what the audience is looking at, because we understand where our characters are and who our characters are based on their relationship to the world and the, you know, to the other characters in the world around them.
Mm-hmm. And an example of that is also, like, I guess as directors and writers, and sometimes often people are both, you're responsible for every single thing that you're going to put in your screenplay. Otherwise, it's going to come back to you in the face. Because if you're writing your character and you haven't done the research, you haven't built the world of this character, then your character is going to be flawed, right? Or like, you're not going to have a three-dimensional character. So it's both the visual world and then the narrative world as well. And I have an example of that, a film that Walter and I worked on, which was a big feature film about terrorism. And the day we were supposed to shoot like the room where they have photos of the terrorists, the director hadn't built a world and hadn't decided what kind of photos he wants on the wall, like what kind of terrorists he wants, like where are they from, who are they working for, blah, 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 blah. And the art team had to Google 5 minutes before rolling and print like some generic photos from a generic, like, free of right website. And they had no idea like what to do about that. So that's a huge mistake. And then Walter, maybe you can tell us about your experience as well. But like, for me, that's a clear example of like not doing the work in the script, that you don't know you're putting those secondary characters that are heavy, right? That like represent a lot of like loaded messages, and you're not doing the work, and both narratively and also visually, if that makes sense. So that's something that I think for those of you who are directors or like director of photographies or like creators like that, like creative creators, that's something that is fundamental, because you're going to look like a fool on set and you're going to waste a lot of time if you're not putting the work. Like, you're responsible for every single thing that you put in your script. Yeah. So I guess that's my next question as well. When you're doing that early on visual research and you're bringing it to set, what are the things, like you said, you mentioned, like making sure that the characters are basically deep. and have their given circumstances here, right? Visually and then narratively. What are some other things, maybe even practical things that you have to think about when you're a creator and build?
Okay. So, well, I want to first off say that, like, as a director, like, let's say we're just going to talk about being a director and then what's expected of you from your team. Designers don't expect that you're going to know exactly what things look like, but they're going to expect that you've thought about some stuff and you've thought about things and you have an idea, right? So I think part of what's important about this conversation is also just what are the things that one should be paying attention to, right? Because often we talk a lot, there's a lot of talk about like why this camera angle and why is this lit this way, right? Like the way you light something is also a visual language. It's the revelation of form. It's how do we see and relate to the body as it exists in the space of the world. So for example, I was watching Troop Zero yesterday, and if you can watch it, it's great. You know, it's a very tight color palette, very specific design choices across the board. And there was a shot though of this main character who is considered like a start. She has no friends. She's a little weird kid. She's just trying to figure herself out, and she's alone. And to show that, they had her running across a field by herself, and she's like literally, if this is the screen, she's literally like this big, going like running across at the bottom of the frame, and you just got this sense of this, you know, and then she like falls over and then gets up, and you get this sense that she's this little resilient girl who is all alone and just trying to figure everything out. And so you get that sense just from that shot and the way that she's scaled within it. So that those are a lot of the conversations I think that happen, but what people forget to talk about are the world things, of like the actual things that go in front of the camera that create what it is. And I think the big thing as a director in looking at things and like also as a writer, it's making sure you've thought about all the different points of, for example, that terrorist group. Like if it's a film about terrorism, what kind of terrorism are we talking about? What does that mean, right? Going into the themes of, you know, I think it's also really good to think about your film from a thematic, ethereal space first, and like theoretical space before you jump into your research, so that you understand the why behind the images as you start to find them, or you can connect with the why before you go looking into imagery, because that then informs how what starts to resonate with you. So getting really clear of like, what is this person? What are these characters like? How would they live? So that way you can then kind of come in and have a real dialogue with your designer. But I think it's just better, the sooner you have an idea of what you're thinking, the more formulated of what you're looking for, maybe even just discussing like, okay, I want their house to feel cramped, crowded, I want it to reflect that like there's no space. In an episode of my podcast coming up with a production designer, she talks about how this character they wanted to feel like this character had no space. So he was living with his mom. He's this recovering vet from, you know, World War or Vietnam vet. And they wanted it to be really clear that he had no space. So he was living in his mother's trailer with her, and the whole place is covered with all her tchotchkes, right? So there's no room for this guy. So it's having those thoughts of also not just how do the plot points move and how do we tell that world and the story and through camera angles and through lighting, but then also how do we want to utilize the locations in the film to tell us something about who these characters are? What do we need these spaces to give us? Because even having that clarity of like, I need, you know, in another episode with a production designer that Lauren Weeks, it's one of my first episodes on the podcast, he talks about, you know, this one time they did a scene and it was set in a loft, and there was like a couch, and it was this artist loft, and it was very sparse. He's like, look, the reason we were there wasn't for the couch and where I put the couch. The reason we were there was for the room and what the room needed to do, of being this really big, large space that, you know, gave you this sense of this artist and, you know, was really sparse. And so it becomes about having the conversation of what do those rooms mean and how we want us to tell that story. And then looking at, as you start to flush out those ideas and you start to go like, okay, this is, regardless of, you know, if you're doing a sci-fi film, maybe is it a sci-fi fantasy world a la, you know, Fifth Element, Star Wars, or is it something more, you know, based in reality that is just like a sci-fi reality? For example, like some of the Black Mirror episodes where everything's really normal except there's just like some weird science-y thing that then turns the world upside down. So I think that becomes the question of, well, like, what kind of world is it in that respect? And then if that's the case, what are the rules of this world? And what do we need this world to give us? And why do these rules matter in relationship to the characters we're telling? And then how does that play out visually? Like, is, you know, and that can also be like, you know, for a comedy, you're going to usually want brighter colors, right? And you want fun, happy, you know, color worlds. And for a drama, you're going to want more serious, muted, tonal colors. So then just being able to, like, those are the world, like, that's part of the world that we're creating. I think like that's how you start then taking those ideas and, you know, fleshing them out and asking the questions. And you don't need to have all the answers as a director. That's why you then bring in designers to then amplify those ideas. It's a, you know, and also if you haven't thought about it, it's okay to say, you know, I haven't thought about that. Let me think about it for a moment. Because people like to hear that, actually. Like, as a designer, I like to hear that. I want you to actually think about what you're doing and what you want so I can better serve you. And then that also avoids you being disappointed on the other end of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a time and a place for everything. Like, if also it's important to listen to your designers, and if they say I need a response about this because I need to go shopping by tomorrow, then it's important to be able to do that as well. So when you're building, I guess like this whole thing is about building wholesomeness, right? For the project across the board. How do you know that you're on the right track? Because you're specifically, if you're the screenwriter or you're the director, you're kind of the boss of the set, right? I mean, I guess you're accountable to producers and stuff, but how do you know that you're like, when you think of like films like Wes Anderson's films that are so wholesome and combined and tight with the world building, how do we know that we're heading in that direction? Like, how do we know that we're like on track with our own aesthetic goals, if that makes sense? And the rules, and playing with the rules that we've established.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Some of that's practice. Like, a lot of that is practice, but I also think there is instead of saying, do I like this? You ask yourself, is this working? Because then it becomes about what the work is itself and what is really needed for the story. And then you can say, you know I love this clock, but the reality is the clock doesn't fit in the world that we've created because, you know, maybe it's got too much of an analog vibe and we want this to feel like really super digitally, right? And so, or, you know, maybe the world's too shiny and we need it to be a little dulled down. So how can we do that? And so I think that it becomes looking at things from that perspective. I also think that carrying your visuals with you is really important, or having them accessible to you while you're doing the process. So like, if you're a director and have ideas of how you'd like to see the scenes and how you would like to shoot things, I feel like oftentimes I see people leave their stuff once we start production, they leave all that behind. And I think going back and re-referencing that and reminding yourself of what it is you're looking at and what it is that's inspired you and the things that you value, because we're also talking about what are your visual values with this project and how do those values translate into what's in front of the camera, you know. And I think also to think about when we look at things, I mean, there's also that level of, well, like part of it is also we're building a 3-dimensional world that we're then going to flatten, right? And so it becomes about also about how do we see it in that way. So when thinking about this kind of how do you know if you're on the right track, in a lot of ways you also are like, I think I am, but I'm, you know, it feels like I am. It's, you know, it's always a little difficult. Like, I know I've had moments where I was like, I don't know, I'm going to do this crazy, wild, like idea that this cast member wants, you know, is asking for. And I have no idea if it's going to actually work in the way that I'm, you know, anticipating it working. And so I think that you just end up also having to try things out and see what happens, and be okay if you don't always stick it, you know, and that's okay. Like, everything's an experience and an experiment and practice. But the great thing is, if you can get in the habit of practicing all of those visual conversations before you get on set, before you go into pre-production, the odds are you're going to be getting more of what you want out of the film process, and like more of what you want out of the visual storytelling of it, because you've also sat and thought about it. So even if you then get stressed out on set and things move quickly and you don't have, you know, you don't have the time you thought you'd have, you've done all this visual research to kind of help you and your team move forward in a way that's thought out and just deliberate, and that will then resonate in the final product. From a lot of the festival people that I've talked to, and like what I've been asked over the years, that's kind of led me to doing webinars like this and led me to my podcast and the courses that I create, are a lot of festival programmers and people telling me, well, we just don't know how to get the production value up. And I think a major part of that is asking this question of, what is this world? Who are these characters? Why are we telling this story right now? How does this story relate to our current world, visually, emotionally? You know, what are the nuances and things that that go into telling all those juxtapositions and how people relate? And I think if you come from that conversation if you come with that already in advance, the odds are you'll get more of what you want, because your team will understand how to execute things. Execute it. They'll know they'll understand the language you're trying to tell. So like Wes Anderson works with the same production designer and has been with the same production designer for almost all of his films. And so that is a very deep relationship and understanding of needs that has been built up over time, and allows for a bit of a shorthand, and allows for, you know, more of a ease of conversation. But it also has allowed Wes Anderson to then hone his skills and hone his perspective and what inspires him. So I think that, you know, again, it's just practice. Everything's practice. Yeah. I mean, you could start small in your kitchen. You can start playing with color palette with things in your house. Start playing with textures with things in your house. You can start playing with shapes, right? And form. Is it a world that's really jagged and harsh? So therefore we have really straight lines, and we have, you know, concrete walls or metal walls, and, you know, you can't, you know, it's just inaccessible. So therefore also there's like no way to scale the sides of the buildings because there's nowhere to grab onto maybe. Whereas something that's maybe more of, maybe it's a world that's a little more organic. And so, yes, there's this big impenetrable wall, but it's made out of stone. So we can kind of rock climb it and like climb up the side of it and things have more softer, natural qualities to them. So you start asking questions like that then to then understand where those worlds are. You know, also like looking at Wes Anderson, they play a lot with texture. They play a lot, like the clothes have texture to them. The world has a texture to them that is then being represented throughout the different spaces, and it's a stylized texture.
Mm-hmm. And it's I've seen directors like you were saying, it's important to carry your visuals. I've seen directors like come on set with in their pocket like the color palette, and then making sure that they have that handy at all times, or like a few adjectives that they want, like fluid, not fluid, like harsh, round, like all these different things that the different departments head can then they can translate that across the board on set, right? Because you sometimes have to make decisions like this goes there, like when you're also building the frame. And I sent everyone a character wheel as well, that you use in acting and that directors use as well to direct actors when you're kind of like losing track of the world. Like this character is like this is the baseline of this character. So it's helpful, I think, like you were saying, to remind yourself of your rules, and when you don't know what to say, like to go back to it and have this little toolkit that you prepare specifically as a director, like before, like in pre-production, that you can just have on set with you every single day. Just like actors, like as an actor, I have my music, I have my playlist for like each project that I know I'm going to be working on this song, and I like prepare with those songs beforehand and stuff. So having something that you can always go back to, that connects you to the world, is I think very important and can be very insightful. We're gonna open up to questions. If you guys have any questions, you can write them in the comments. Sarah, is there anything else that you want to add? Any other kind of suggestions or that you have, or anything like any traps that you find that directors find themselves in?
I think the biggest trap in world building is only going to the internet. Like that is actually, I think, the biggest problem with visual research at this moment in time, is that it's really easy to go online and type in what you're looking for and have a myriad of hosts bring up imagery, and they're all really great. Like I was showing someone, I was purposefully not going into photography books. I was just like putting together some thoughts for a shoot I'm doing, just to kind of get the ball rolling mentally. And I was like, showed a friend, I was like, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about doing. And she's like, oh, I've used that image and that image and that image. You know, and thinking of my work even as a costume designer, of like, oh no, we just got a script and we have to do a design presentation tomorrow, and the only thing I can use is the internet, so let me pull these images. And it's like, oh, well, this is why everyone's Russian mafia guys all look the same, because we're all pulling the exact same research images, which are great, but they're one specific perspective, rather than going out and looking for different experiences and different photography. So I think the biggest pitfall in world building and any sort of visual research is solely relying on the internet, when there are, you know, it's a limited resource. So if you can get, you know, books, you know, photography books, research, still photographers to get inspiration from that, look at artists, whatever it is that you're kind of interested in getting, dive deeper, maybe use the internet as an initial thing to find some artists and find some things of interest, and then go to the library when they open back up again, and go into the library sections with the artists you want, and see who else is next to them, right? So you just don't know what pulling a book out off of a shelf in the library is going to then do for you creatively. You know, I've been inspired and moved many times by finding an artist in a library that I never would have found if I hadn't gone to the library, because all of a sudden there was a book, or like roaming a bookstore, and then like there's this book that is, I couldn't imagine doing the film without. So I think that ends up being a really important way to keep your imagery fresh, keep your inspiration fresh, and then kind of help you fill holes that you're going to definitely have if you only rely on the internet to provide you, you know, because the internet's also like Google word search, and it's not going to necessarily be in the first page of the internet that you're going to find what you're looking for. And so also being willing, I guess the other pitfall would be giving up too soon, right? Or just like, I need a quick answer, here's a quick answer, and then moving on, versus like, that's one thing, right? That happens where like, okay, they just threw something at me and I wasn't ready for it, and now I'm going to deal with this problem as fast as I can. But then there's, I'm getting ready to do this film. It's a very important film to me. I've been working on this for a year, and now we're trying to get the funding so that I can then finish this, make the film. I don't want to be doing the quick answer. You want to avoid that quick answer and go, how do I get really deep in this? How do I bring the same level of depth that I brought to the actual script and like the breakdown of the characters and the arc of the story to the world that I'm telling, and going in and looking for that answer that is a discovery, right? And discovering something that speaks to you in a way that you wouldn't have expected, because often then that brings a dynamic quality to what you're doing. And so I think that that's the biggest, like those are the two mistakes: relying solely on the internet for all your visual research, and not going out to the library, or sorry,
Yes,
not,
and
like giving up too quickly. Words.
And go to the go out in the real world and then see how people live and stuff, and how people dress and how people behave, and all of this. Like, it's about bearing witness as well to the world around you, if you can, Great. Do we have any questions before we like close our conversation? Feel free to write them in the chat. But thank you. Yeah, I hope that was helpful for everyone and you got a lot from it, and it'll help you like build the worlds of your projects. You don't have any questions? That's okay if you don't. Maybe we covered everything.
I mean, that would be amazing. Oh, thanks, Walter. I'm glad that we answered pretty much everything.
Just about it.
I think also my other like last takeaway for everyone is to have fun with it. Like, have fun with the world we're telling, and like have fun with pushing yourself and asking the deep questions about the work we're doing. And, like I said, that's the big thing that a lot of festival programmers have said to me, that they wish filmmakers knew how to do better, had better production quality. And I think that can really start with having the conversations earlier and communicating with people and sharing images back and forth as well. Like, I think it's also in building this world. So as the director, you're overseeing the initial kind of genesis, and then you're kind of like a thought bubble, right? So you've got like the thought bubble in the middle, and then all these little shoots that come off of how, this world, and like the costumes, the hair, the makeup, the word, the production design, the prop design, the camera angles, I think that if you start you then are going to have an initial thought about all of those, but then you're also going to hand off that bubble to a department head and to run with it. And I think then taking all of their imagery and making sure that they're all sharing it with one another allows the design departments to really communicate well together. And often gaffers don't necessarily talk to me, or DPs don't talk to me and tell me what they're thinking about doing with the lighting. Well, lighting affects how my clothes are seen. It affects how you shoot. It affects the details that are noticed, right? And so understanding what's inspiring the other creators and collaborators, and sharing imagery and sharing conversations allows me to then be more integrated into what their worlds are, and realize a bigger picture. And then as the director, you're just kind of you're a part of the management of that and the leading of that, rather than at that point, like the doing of it. And so I think you can then kind of move the conversations along together to then really get this cohesive world by getting your team together to have a conversation as a unit. Have an initial one of like, let's talk through the script and just talk about what this world is and what it means to us as a team. And then everybody can go out, and then they'll come back and have another conversation about research and what they're thinking there. So I think that can really help get things to a much more deeply meaningful place that is also well thought out, and a world that is tangible and tactile.
Well, that makes sense. I hope that's helpful for everyone. You can always like write us an email, find us on Instagram. Sarah, how can we find you on social media?
You can find me on social media. My podcast is at Designing the Void, and my personal is at Sarah Cogan Designs.
Easy peasy.
Yep.
And you can find us SetPatrol at SetPatrol _EU across the board on Facebook and everything. We're going to have more webinars. If you're interested in following the journey of SetPatrol, we're going to be launching our website pretty soon. I think everyone is like familiar with the concept, but if you're not, it's basically a European platform that allows filmmakers to rent and buy gear from each other. So a little bit like Airbnb, but for cameras. And we also have a whole community aspect with webinars like we're doing today, tutorials, job listings, crew listings, all of that. So we're like the global kind of community for filmmakers based in Europe. So thank you everyone for coming today. If you have any questions, reach out. Thanks. It was lovely to chat with you, Sarah, as always.
Thank you for having me.
I hope that was helpful. I hope that was helpful for everyone. And thanks for coming, everyone. We'll see you soon. Keep in touch with your projects as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.